Welcome back, everyone. So our last video talked about Locke's distinction between sensation and reflection, and his claim that all of our ideas and knowledge come from these two sources. In this video, we're going to look at some of his evidence that he presents in favor of this hypothesis. So in this video, we're going to review those two experiential sources, and then we're going to look at that evidence in favor. We're going to look at what I'm going to call the argument from child development, the argument from subtraction and variation, and the argument from order. And honestly, all of these could likely be called arguments from psychological development because they all have to do with observations we make about the developmental process by which we gain ideas of the world. And he uses that as evidence in favor of the claim that those ideas come from experience. And so Locke describes his view as the theory that all our ideas and knowledge come from experience, as I said. But remember, there's those two sources of knowledge and ideas that he broadly describes as experiential. There's sensation, which has to do with, you might say, experience of external objects. This is a sort of outer sense. But then there's reflection. We can turn our attention inwards on our own mind, and he thinks we can thereby get an awareness, an experience of what our mind is doing. And that is a kind of inner sense. So we experience not just tables and chairs, we also experience our beliefs. Now, Locke does think of this as a kind of perception, just as there's the external table and then there's my perception of it, which is something separate, an awareness of it. The table could exist without my awareness, without my perception of it. Similarly, the belief in my mind, the reasoning in my mind is one thing, and my experience of that reasoning, my experience or awareness or perception of my beliefs is a separate thing. You can kind of think of this like the mind sort of turning a spotlight. Sometimes the belief might be there even though the spotlight isn't on there. So you don't have the experience of the belief. You don't have the spotlight there to be aware or perceive of it. So think in both cases, outer sense and inner sense, there's a spotlight. The difference is just the object that it's pointed at. In the case of sense perception, our spotlight is pointed at and aware of external objects. In the case of inner sense, our perception or experience or awareness, that spotlight is directed at the operations of our own mind, our reasoning, our doubting, our willing, etc. All right, so why should we believe that these two things can account for all of our ideas? Well, for the first thing, Locke gives an argument from child development. He says, he who attentively considers the state of a child at his first coming into the world will have little reason to think him stored with plenty of ideas that are able to be the matter of his future knowledge. Now here, it is by degrees he comes to be furnished with them. So it looks like ideas slowly develop over time. Surely a 2-month-old child, we can all recognize that they have less ideas of the world around them than even a 6-month-old. But a 6-month-old has less ideas, fewer ideas of the world around them than a 2-year-old. These ideas slowly develop over time. So let's call this the argument from child development. So when we observe very young children, they seem to have very few ideas in their understanding. So my 2-year-old son has fewer ideas about things in the world than I do. Moreover, the younger the child, the fewer ideas they seem to have. So as I go back in time, my son had fewer ideas of the world around him when he was 1-year-old. And if I go back to 6 months old, he had even fewer ideas. And if I go back to him being a newborn, he seemed to have very few ideas whatsoever. So a child's development of their ideas takes place in degrees. So they have some ideas and then more ideas and then more ideas. They don't just get all of them at one time. Moreover, it takes a long period of time. I mean, faster than you might think if you ever watch a child. It's kind of amazing, which the speed with which they get it might actually be a problem for empiricism, according to some more recent psychologists. But according to Locke, he says the best explanation of the development of ideas in children is that experiences furnishes them with these ideas. Why would it take time to gain these ideas? Well, look, it takes time to gain experience with things. And so as you gain more experience through time, you would then expect them to get more ideas as they get more experience. And so this makes perfect sense if experience is the source of our ideas. And so since this is the best and simplest explanation, probably our ideas are furnished by experience. He also gives an argument from subtraction or variation, as I'm going to call it. So he says, I think it will be granted easily that if a child were kept in place where he never saw any other but black and white until he were a man, he would have no more ideas of scarlet or green than he who from his childhood never tasted an oyster or a pineapple has of those particular relishes. So the claim here is, if you subtract the experience so that they don't experience any colors, he thinks, wouldn't that also take away the idea? They won't have the idea of red, green, etc. Similarly, look, if you've never tasted a particular food, then you don't have any idea of what that particular food tastes like. If you take away the experience, you take away the idea. He also says, men then come to be furnished with fewer or more simple ideas from without, according as the objects they converse with afford greater or lesser variety. So the more things you interact with, the more ideas you have of external objects. The fewer things you interact with, the less ideas you have. And from the operations of their minds within, according as they more or less reflect on them. My ideas of my own mind, the more I reflect on and attend to and experience and sort of pay attention to, the more ideas I have about the mind itself. About the beliefs I have, the knowledge I have, the doubts I have, the more I introspect, the more I have ideas about my own mind. But the less reflective person, the person who doesn't take time to sort of think about their own mind, they're going to have less ideas of those. And so when we subtract the experience, we also subtract the corresponding idea from the person's understanding. When people have experience with different kinds of objects, they tend to have different ideas from one another. And the number of ideas people have of the operations of their own minds correlates with the degree to which they tend to consider those operations attentively. So the more you introspect, the more ideas you have about your own mind. The less you introspect, the fewer ideas you have of those operations. He thinks these correlations between experience and ideas seem to be best explained by the theory that the experiences are the source of those ideas. Thus, he says, probably our experiences are the source of our ideas. There's also an argument from order here. So he says the ideas of obvious and familiar qualities imprint themselves before the memory begin to keep a register of time or order. So those very common things we encounter, like colors and shapes, we get those ideas so early we don't even remember getting the ideas. But he says, yet, it is often so late before some unusual qualities come in the way that there are few men who cannot recollect the beginning of their acquaintance with them. I remember getting the idea of Vegemite. I never sort of heard of this. I was never introduced to it until I went to Australia when I was probably 16. And now I have the idea of Vegemite and of the taste of Vegemite. But I got that much later, that sort of unusual thing. You don't encounter, like in the US, you don't encounter Vegemite very often. He also says, hence we see the reason why it is pretty late before most children get ideas of the operations of their own minds, and some do not have any very clear, perfect ideas of the greatest part of them all their lives, because though they pass there continually, yet, like floating visions, they make not deep impressions enough to leave in their mind clear, distinct, lasting ideas until the understanding turns inward upon itself, reflects on its own operations, and makes them the objects of its own contemplation. So here's the claim that is, we get ideas of physical objects like chairs, tables, beds, microphones, of shapes, colors. We get those ideas first. But ideas about our own minds, about beliefs, about perceptual experiences, about memory, those ideas seem to come after we already have an idea of sort of external objects, for instance. And there's quite a bit of psychology nowadays to back this up. There's some interesting psychological research about children's development of the idea of appearance versus reality. So reality, the way the external world, physical objects are in and of themselves, appearance being how we experience those ideas, those things. So there's the table, and then there's how the table appears to us, and those don't always match. Similarly, belief, fundamental to the idea of belief, is the idea that beliefs can be false. Young children, they have ideas of tables and chairs, but they don't seem to have a grasp on the appearance of a table or on the idea of the belief about a table, because they don't understand that beliefs can be false. So, for instance, if I were to take this object right here while someone else is in the room and that someone leaves the room, and then I hide it in a drawer, the child would think that the person, when they come back, is going to look for it in the drawer, even though they didn't see it go there, because the child doesn't have this idea that they can have a belief that doesn't match reality. They haven't gotten this idea of a false belief yet. So let's put this argument together. The idea is, our ideas of ordinary things with which we have more common and familiar experience tend to develop earlier than the ideas of unusual things where experience is rare and infrequent. And moreover, our ideas of sensations, or ideas of tables, chairs, colors, shapes, those seem to develop in children before the ideas of reflection, before they have any idea of a mind, a belief, knowledge, people wanting or desiring or doubting. They don't have those ideas until much later in their development. The claim is that the order, the fact that we get these ideas first and these other ideas later, is best explained by empiricism. Obviously, if we have more experience with certain kinds of objects, we're more likely to get those ideas first, and the more rare our experience is, the longer it'll take for us to interact with those things and get those ideas. Similarly, if the ideas of of belief, knowledge, willing, doubting, if those ideas of the operation of our own mind is due to an experience with the ideas, I need to get ideas of sensation first to reason with. So I need to get those sensory ideas first, and then I can reason with those ideas. And then once I reason with those ideas, I can then experience them. Therefore, empiricism is probably true. So that's all for this video. See y'all next time. Bye-bye.